Welcome back. We are back for the GP podcast series 3. Joe, are you excited?
I'm excited, and I don't want to hang around. I want to go straight in with a controversial take here, because today we're going to be talking about sermon series graphics. And this might be something which is happening a little bit less these days, but you go to a church website and I can pretty much guarantee that what you're going to see front and center is a sermon graphic. And you might have a slider or a carousel with a couple of them because we have morning and evening services. And it's not the end of the world. I'm not going to be overly dramatic here. They might be some really nice looking graphics, but I think it's worth asking ourselves, is it really the thing that people need to see first? What role are the graphics playing, and do we really need them?
Yeah. So why does this discussion matter? If they're just nice graphics that are going to point people to our teaching, surely by asking the question, we're just being difficult.
Yeah, true to form, we're just being difficult. I think a big thing for me is the amount of focus and attention that goes into the sermon series graphics. So I know from experience that running just a small creative team of 3 people, volunteers at a church, the vast majority of our time went into coming up with ideas for the sermon series graphics and actually making them. And the ideas themselves could take a while, because often the ideas that the preachers give when they tell you the title of the series can be a little bit cheesy, a little bit on the nose. And so trying to come up with something around that can take time and energy. But then obviously, even when you have those ideas, you have to create things, all these different assets, whether that's website graphics, thumbnails for YouTube videos, social media posts, PowerPoint backgrounds, all these things. And so they're not a bad thing. And if there's something which is really important, then it's okay to take time over them. But I think it's just worth asking what their role is, who are they for, and then can we justify the amount of time?
So it might be nice to think, is this helpful for our external audiences? Catching their interest, maybe sort of getting them to have a look to him or of the teaching, and that's good, but is that really the case? Realistically, it's more for the internal audiences, people already involved with the church. And it's not a bad thing. It's a great way to encourage them and keep them interested in what's coming up. And I do think it gives a sort of sense of identity and direction.
Yeah.
And kind of a unity in the vision of the teaching, the preaching, and the church as a whole. But given how much input it takes with all of the things, you've mentioned already, is it worth it? Especially given chances are all of those people will be coming along to a Sunday anyway. Does it matter? And if this is the case, we have to ask the question, is the latest sermon graphic the most important thing to show people on our websites as the first thing they see? I suppose it might be, Bible teaching is obviously a hugely important part of church life, but, perhaps they'd be better served by a good welcome message, concisely communicating a feel of the church vision and inviting them to take the next steps in finding out more, maybe.
Yeah, and I think this is something that we've covered in our practical episodes on church website tips as well. So we will link to those in the description of today's episode. Yeah.
And, we've said already about social media, it can become incredibly one-dimensional if we're just inviting people to a Sunday service the whole time. And the same is true if our website is purely pointing people to the sermon series, because effectively that's the same thing of just inviting people to the Sunday service.
Yeah, so don't get me wrong here. I'm a designer. I think that sermon graphics can be really important and really attractive as well. I think it's an opportunity to be creative, where if you're designing a poster for a carol service, there's a kind of a limit to what you can pitch that. But you can be more creative and think more outside of the box with the sermon series. So really the question is, how can we do them efficiently? How can we make great sermon series graphics without it becoming this huge task?
I suppose it's worth saying, first off, if you don't have creatives within your church congregational team to give it to, perhaps, you're a vicar, minister, pastor who's having to do all of this yourself. And as great as Canva is, you can really struggle designing designing anything, not just sermon graphics, or whether that's using the tools or having some creative visual ideas or just the time, if you don't have all of those things to get you in the right place to do it, it's certainly nothing to sort of feel guilty about, but it might be worth thinking, maybe about outsourcing it. Budgets, are always tight, even more so at the moment, but it's probably worth at least considering that if it is more efficient to do it this way and pass it on to someone, if you can invest a small amount financially, but it gives you the time and the headspace and you end up with better visual results, it is worth it in the end if the cost is worth what you get out of it.
Yeah, it's definitely a discussion to have and something to consider. But I think also we want to be as helpful as possible, and if you are keeping it in-house, we want to give you some advice. So my biggest piece of advice with sermon graphics would be to use templates. And that's not to say to go out and buy pre-made templates, but to create templates for yourself. Worth saying this goes for all design, not just sermon series. So for your event publicity, maybe other ministries, youth work, where a graphic is needed fairly frequently, or even a format that if you often produce things in A5, having some elements in a template all ready to go can be really helpful. But especially for sermon graphics, my advice would be to find a format that works across as many of these different assets and places that you publish as possible, and then use similar versions across all of them. So in my experience, 16:9 widescreen format is great for this. That is the same shape as the widescreen video, so it will work perfectly for your YouTube thumbnails. But also projectors these days tend to be in that format as well. So it would be great for your PowerPoints and promoting upcoming series in that sense. But it also doesn't hurt for social media graphics to be that shape. So go about in whatever program or app you're using, set up a 16:9 ratio file. So if you're sticking to the YouTube thumbnail dimensions, that'll be 1920 pixels wide by 1080 high. And then the first thing we're going to do is pop the church logo in there, put it in whichever corner works best, and maybe add a few different versions, all the same size, but just you can hide the ones that you don't need to use. And that means that when you put something behind it, you can choose different colours, a different version of the logo for whatever's going to look best. The next thing I do then is, when it comes to actually creating a graphic for a sermon series, I duplicate that template, add in a background image. If it is something really simple or sort of more graphical rather than a photo, then you can just use a color. So maybe you have that in your template as well as the different colors from your brand guidelines. So yeah, choose a background image. And then all you need to do from that point is add the title of the sermon series over the top of it and choose a font for that. If we're really distilling it down, that's as simple as you can get to create an effective sermon graphic. Yeah.
So you mentioned already about preachers' ideas often being really on the nose.
Yeah.
And it's something that we talk about often. And I do think it's worth saying that just because you're doing a series on Moses, and I've seen, not this exact situation, but I've seen something very similar, doesn't mean you need to have a picture or several pictures of Charlton Heston as part of the graphics, and they're probably just screen grabs rather than actual photos. In the same way, if you've got a youth group poster, it doesn't always need to be a bunch of kids having fun. And you try to think a little out of the box, think about the key element of the series you want to get across. It may be helpful to have a brief discussion with the preacher, or if you've got guest preachers and speakers,
just have some back and forth.
Yeah, get a bit of kind of okay, we're talking about Moses. We don't need to have literally Moses there. Perhaps he's talking about, I don't know, living in the desert or something like that. You could have just sand, and okay, that's a little bit, but it's just taking it down a little bit of thinking, actually, how can this be sort of efficient? Think about the key elements. And in terms of general design tips, we've mentioned it before, but I don't want to say it's upsetting, but I see it so often. Don't just throw a load of different fonts at the graphic. you know, you just don't, because it hurts people's eyes. Keep it simple. Chances are that only one text element are needed within, you know, church name, series title, and maybe even a subtitle. You know, you can get away with having one or two, but do kind of think, do they fit? And there are loads of guides, I suppose they are, but loads of websites or articles and stuff about, you know, Canva fonts that match.
Yeah, that work well together. Yeah, so just practicing that restraint from a design point of view is really helpful. And we've kind of alluded to it as well, but it can be really helpful to have brand guidelines on hand. So what your logo looks like, the fonts that you tend to use. I'm not saying you have to stick with them, particularly for the series title, but you know which fonts work well and which don't with your brand fonts. So that will help you to keep consistency from series to series. Not to say that everything will look identical, but just keeping your church brand voice going through there. So yeah, using your template, creating it in this way is really simple. From the point where you've actually got your design, taking it one step further, I'd export it, and you've got a version already that you can use for social media potentially. You can use for your video thumbnails, and as I said, the sort of sermon slide, the PowerPoint slide which says this series is coming soon. But I would also then just hide a couple of layers from the design that I've made and export a version which doesn't have the text on the top, so just the background image and the church logo. And that could then be used as a background for your PowerPoint slides as well, which you may want to put a like a translucent box over the background just to make the text easier to read. But it just helps when it comes to the PowerPoint design that it's all consistent, still within that theme. And I would actually, if I had the time, go ahead and create a PowerPoint template for the sermon series as well. So using the graphics as I've described, but actually creating a PowerPoint file with a few different layouts in it that a preacher can use. Obviously, this saves the preacher some work, but it also avoids them just going down the Comic Sans route and having a PowerPoint which really doesn't look very good at all.
Or they're using loads of different slides.
Loads and loads of different slides and fonts and just filling it with text. I think if you're putting a template together and saying this is the sort of size that a title is and this is how many bullet points you can roughly get on a slide, then hopefully it gives a hint of saying don't put double that many bullet points, don't put twice the amount of text, because people won't be able to read it. And this also really helps if you've got different preachers who are preaching throughout the series as well, because there's that consistency between them.
Yeah, and like Canva's so great for helping you with templates and sizing. You know, you can reformat without having to recreate from scratch. You know, all you need to do is just, you've got your base design, and then you just resize it. Okay, it might not be exactly the same if you're going from, you know, more landscape to portrait, but at least you've got all of the elements in there. It definitely saves you time. But it means that you're able to build that consistency and that brand for a sermon series or an event or something. You know, you're able to use that across multiple platforms, and actually people will start to recognize it and go, oh, I get what that is, or oh, I missed that one, I'm going to listen to that, and or I'm going to come to church on Sunday because I've seen it. Yeah,
definitely. So to round things off on this, and I've already mentioned Comic Sans, so I'm going to quote Adam Savage from Mythbusters fame, and he's got a YouTube channel, and this video is called About Comic Sans. So he says, I'm a believer that everyone should have a little bit of graphic design under their belts, because I think graphic design is a discipline that improves all the other making disciplines. It requires you to understand form and narrative and function and communication in a way that is very direct and immediate. And my graphic design background has made me better at all the other things I do. And I think that's a really helpful approach to have. We talk a lot about design. I think we both think it's really important. And it can really inform on lots of other things, maybe even the preaching itself, as you consider what does need to be in there, what doesn't need to be in there in order to get your message across. But at the same time, I don't think either of us would say it's anywhere near the most important thing that a church should be thinking about. So we just want to help by suggesting that you bring in these simple changes in the way that we go about our designs, and specifically our sermon graphic designs. Whether that's simplifying things visually so that we better communicate our message, or whether that's increasing the efficiency in the way that we work to better manage our workload and take the pressure off, we think it can really make a difference to what you're doing as a church.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always said I wanted to do a webinar on I'm not a graphic designer, but and essentially talk about how easy it would be to just thinking through graphic design elements, but I'm not formally or at all trained as a graphic designer. So I think it's so easy to just pick up things if you're conscious in how you're doing it. So hopefully these design tips here can help you to do that. Hopefully. If you want to listen to where we've talked about it before, have a scroll back all the way back to series 1, episode 9, where we talked about tips for avoiding terrible church flyers and posters, as we did sort of expand on some really practical graphic design tips in there.
Yeah, and hopefully you also come away from today's episode not just being able to design sermon graphics more effectively, not just doing it more efficiently, but also with a bit of a challenge on how to actually use them, and particularly their prominence in your communications output as a church.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's it from us today. We are very excited that our next episode we will be talking about the murky subjects of privacy and GDPR with a very special guest. So come back for our next episode.